So when we turn to Second Chronicles, it's a lot more of the same, right? It's still sanitizing to the nth degree. You're not going to get a deathbed speech of David advising Solomon on how to bump people off.
Right.
You're not even going to get the episode of the two prostitutes.
Yep.
Prostitutes?
Right.
You don't get prostitutes in Chronicles. Gibeon was a great high place in Kings, but here it's just that the tent of meeting is there.
Right.
There weren't really high places.
Right. Everything, even small stuff. In a sense, Chronicles gives us a window into what kinds of things might have been bothersome to somebody that we might not be bothered by when we read Kings, right?
Yeah.
But you can see, okay, well, what did they get rid of, and how and why? It is interesting. Like, Chronicles, for all of its temple focusedness, is certainly in the first in the first volume, is in being less fun than Kings. It, as you said, it cuts good stories. It's a little bit more like, well, here's just what happened politically or cultically, which is partly why it's something of a slog, I think, to read, relative at least to
That
Kings.
is, if you're not really into temple liturgy.
Right.
And you're not burning with curiosity to find out who actually organized the choir
Right.
in the temple. It's an odd book in that regard.
It is. But, it's essentially, just to step back broadly, it's what would happen if I told the story, the history of Israel, and all I really cared about was the temple. Right? What if that were the central focus? And so one of the interesting things that happens is, in the way that, as we said, Deuteronomy says, you'll build a temple somewhere, right? And then Kings has it sort of happening, by chance. So in Chronicles, we get reference to Mount Moriah, which I think we've not heard about since Genesis.
Right. No, I see that as kind of making roots for the temple.
Is it consciously referring back to Genesis? The story would be Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac.
And I would figure it surely is.
Which reminds us of one of the other features of Chronicles is that it has a broader biblical sensibility, such as it were. That is, say, it looks back to Genesis in a way that Kings
as
rarely
our
does.
late Yale colleague Harold Bloom would have said, it is belated literature. This was what Bloom said about the New Testament. And what he meant was, it's literature that derives a lot of its material from older literature. There isn't, you're not immediately struck by originality when you read Chronicles. But maybe that's a mistaken impression too, because in some ways it's very original. There are whole chapters about figures we never heard of before at all.
Sure.
Now take Jehoshaphat, holy Jehoshaphat. Now, Jehoshaphat gets 5 chapters in Chronicles. He had, a couple of verses in Kings. In the course of this, he institutes a reform where he sends Levites out to preach the gospel, to preach the Torah in the provinces. Where does all this come from? And then there is an account of a battle that he fights against the Moabites, which is just a perfect battle. What he does is pray to the Lord, and then does nothing. And then all the other peoples come out and kill each other. And then at the end of it, he walks out to claim the victory. Now, we are perhaps to be pardoned if we're a little bit skeptical about the historicity of that. In Joshua, it's hard enough to believe about the walls of Jericho falling down because they marched around them blowing the trumpets. This is surely a case, I think, where something can happen absolutely properly because you have no actual evidence at all.
So the question then becomes, if we know that Chronicles is using Kings as its primary source, and it tells us something that's not anywhere in Kings, is it purely inventing? I mean, Where does this material about Jehoshaphat come from?
At least I would think the battle with the Moabites comes out of the chronicler's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Now, should we credit him with thinking honestly that this must be how it happened? Baruch Halperin made a good argument one time that we should think of many of the biblical writers as historians who were making a good faith attempt to reconstruct how it happened, even though their methods aren't our methods and they didn't have the kind of evidence we have.
Not the chronicler.
But not the chronicler. Now, I think surely with Jehoshaphat, that these are fictions that serve his purpose, that they're holding up examples of how a good king should behave, mm-hmm. and unimpeded by any kind of fact.
And unimpeded in part because there was no existing facts about Jehoshaphat.
About Jehoshaphat
right?
at all, right. Yeah. Now, the one that gets a lot of attention is that he has Hezekiah celebrate the Passover. Now, we should say back in Kings, this is one of the things that Josiah does after he finds this book of the law of the Lord in the temple. Mm-hmm. And we're told that no Passover like this had been observed since when? The days of Joshua?
Joshua.
Yeah. But now, suddenly we find, actually, Hezekiah did that too.
Which feels like maybe another point in favor of this was not meant to be read alongside Kings, right? These are not complementary histories.
I mean, if you do read it beside Kings, you have to shake your head.
Right.
So why? Can't both be right.
So why does Hezekiah? Is this like just the shifting of praise backward from Josiah to Hezekiah for some reason? What's the?
Well, the idea is Hezekiah was a good and righteous king. Even King says that. So if he was a good and righteous king, surely he must have kept the Passover.
Right.
Now, it doesn't address the question, but was the law perhaps lost at the time?
Right.
Had somebody gone and hidden it in the temple and it hadn't been found yet? But no, there are scholars who have tried to argue that the Chronicles had another version of the history that ended with Hezekiah, and that this was the original draft of the history of the period of the kings.
Do you think so?
No, I don't
me
think
neither.
so. and the reason I don't think so is that the tendency seems so blatant.
Sure.
That he is so intent on cleaning things up, making the good be absolutely good. And then good means you're observing the law of Moses.
Yeah.
Now,
so
that's
yeah, I think one of my favorite places to see that is in between Hezekiah and Josiah.
Yeah.
Is in Manasseh. Now Manasseh is in the Book of Kings, the worst king.
Yeah.
Worse maybe than Jeroboam, or at least equal insofar as Jeroboam is responsible for the fall of the north. Manasseh is responsible for the fall of the south. He's ascribed all of the worst characteristics, right? He worships the wrong gods. He does everything wrong. He also, however, has the longest reign of any king in Israel's history, 55 years, which is outrageous. I mean, that's double most people's lifespan.
And, to do that at a time when those countries were under pressure from these great Mesopotamian empires, and if you look what had happened in the Northern Kingdom, where the life expectancy of kings was very short.
Right. Well, how did
he
must have been good?
King.
He must have been pretty good at what he did.
Yeah.
But of course, from a Deuteronomist's perspective, he did all these terrible things, and that's why generations later, right, the Deuteronomistic history has a sense of transgenerational punishment. Right. This king did something wrong, and they pay for it a few generations later. When Chronicles comes to tell the story of Manasseh, it sanitizes that too, insofar as Manasseh still does all the terrible things, but undergoes sort of like a conversion of sorts, right? Like he sees the light.
Yeah.
And this is, it would seem to be the chronicler's way of explaining the 55 years of reign. Because Chronicles nowhere has this idea of transgenerational punishment. In Chronicles, the good gets rewarded and bad gets punished. And if he reigned for 55 years, it must have been good by the end.
And I think also Chronicles is allowing for the idea of, if not quite not conversion, to another religion,
Redemption.
but of redemption, exactly, because you have that also with Rehoboam early on, that Rehoboam blew it initially and wasn't keeping the law, but then he repented. So you have the possibility of repentance and redemption in Chronicles.
Individual, right? Individual redemption.
Now, given that I think, Manasseh gets such a bad rap in Kings because they need somebody to blame for the destruction of Jerusalem, and it can't be Josiah, who was the only king who did what they thought kings should have done. What happens to Josiah in Chronicles?
Cleaned up. but also toned down.
What does the cleaning up entail? First of all, he starts to seek the Lord already when he is 8, precocious king. And he begins to purge the high places already in his 12th year. So, this is, again, pushing it back. Yeah. There was no time when he wasn't an excellence.
Yeah, it's funny, how do you clean up the hero, right? How do you make the Josiah, the hero of kings, even better? You just start him earlier. And the cleaning up, all of this stuff seems to be in lieu of the finding of the scroll, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't need it.
He
doesn't need it.
Yeah.
Which is, also says something about, I think, about the status of Deuteronomy and of Kings. Right, that scroll is what gives those books sort of their authority.
Yeah.
Unnecessary
and
here.
Equally, I think Kings was concerned to establish the authority of Deuteronomy.
Sure.
Whereas Chronicles doesn't need to do that. Does it have any explanation, really, for the death of Josiah? There's one interesting little thing about it. In Kings, you're not really told how Josiah was killed. He met the Pharaoh at Megiddo, and the Pharaoh killed him. Mm-hmm. And it could well be that the Pharaoh had him executed and decided to replace him.
Yeah.
Whereas in Chronicles, no, he's killed in battle.
Yeah.
Now, maybe also it's a good and honorable thing to be fighting against the Pharaoh. But that's how Josiah ends up here.
Yeah, in Kings, Josiah's death is almost like a surprise to the author. It's unanticipated. It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, he's got the whole prophecy that comes beforehand. In Chronicles, it's a noble death and anticipated. So let me ask this. Why did somebody need to rewrite Kings? I mean, we can understand why, what they did to it, right? We can see, right, the transition from, monarchy to temple. But why was Kings insufficient, if that's the case?
Kings did not attach enough importance to the cult, to the clergy, to the Levites. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is a big part of it. And Kings could give you the impression that some of the heroes of Israel behaved very badly. And we can't have that. So it's a kind of moralizing revision.
Yeah, whereas Kings feels very choppy at times, right? Like it's got the base layer of whatever its sources are, and then you see, oh, there's the Deuteronomist. Oh, there's the Deuteronomist, right? Like poking his head up occasionally. Chronicles has despite obviously some of it being taken from Kings, has a much smoother feel. At no point do you feel like there's something in there that contradicts the chronicler's overall aims or purpose.
Right, yeah. One thing that we should have mentioned probably actually is that it's really in Chronicles that Judah becomes Israel. Mm-hmm. And this is fallout from what had happened back after the destruction of the northern kingdom, that Judah will be referred to as Israel a lot of the
Sure.
time. Certainly the name changes its reference.
I mean, the whole book is a reminder that the history that is useful changes over time, right? The Second Temple period is so wildly different from the First Temple period that it simply needs a new telling of itself to account for the new institutions and the new realities.
It also raises some questions, about what made up the canon. Now, the canon wasn't really firmed up until a long time after this, but you see here already some of the kind of pietistic intentions that went into that, to having normative literature. Whereas a lot of the appeal of Samuel and Kings are the loose edges that were allowed to stay in it. This was the cleaned up version, maybe well-intentioned, but surely counterproductive, that it went too far, and not that widely read, I would suspect,
Sure.
anymore.